You know, Greek tragedy is funny. It's so, it feels so strange to you that you find yourself reading through the chorus and kind of forgetting where you are and what it's about and what's he talking about anyway. It's like a long poem and you don't know what it's about, so you're not very, so it's sometimes useful to just think of where the piece you're reading fits in the whole play. And I have told you before, it really is very true that Aeschylus, of all the tragedians, is the densest in this way. He's certainly the most difficult to read, I think, in Greek. And over the course of the these three plays, they get less dense, so that by the time we get to the Eumenides, it shouldn't be as difficult. So the title of this play, Koiphori in Greek, pretty literal translation is Libation Bearers. It was produced in 458 as the central play in the trilogy. Aeschylus's trilogy was called the Oresteia. Now, Aristophanes, in his comedy of the Frogs, refers to the libation bearers as the Oresteia. So it's not altogether clear whether this is just a mistake or whether the central play is somehow meant to contain the elements of the whole. So, for example, the Agamemnon begins with a reference to the cosmic gods, to the stars. The libation bearers, in its first line, has a reference to Hermes of the underworld, and the Eumenides begins with a reference to Earth, Gaia. Now, Hermes is connected both to the Olympian gods, where he's one of them, and to the underworld because he's the messenger god, the psychopomp, the one who leads souls to Hades. So the question then would be whether just in the references to the three gods in the first three lines of the plays of the trilogy, that somehow the libation bearers is meant to be what connects the other two. Now, in any case, if libation bearers is the title, by itself, it points to the first big problem of the play, since the libation bearers is, the libation bearers are the chorus in the second play. So who are they? We know, if you look on page 135, that they are, this is line 75 through 78. But as for me, since a constraint that beset my city has been laid on me by the gods, for from the house of my father they led me to a fate of servitude, it looks as though, I mean, it's certainly the case that they're captive women, probably, since it's not clear that Clytemnestra and Aegisthus have waged any foreign wars, probably that means from Troy. So we look at page 140 and you get this. What shall come mighty with the spear, deliverer of the house, brandishing in his hands the Scythian armament, and in close combat wielding weapons whose haft he grasps. So it looks as though they are, where they call for an avenger, they're calling for a Scythian avenger, which means an Asian avenger. So the play opens and you think they're simply the They're supporters of Electra. She goes down to leave libations for her fathers, doesn't know quite how to do it, what to say, asks their advice. It looks as though they're very close with one another. Orestes will say, oh, I can tell she's Electra because she's really mourning where the others are just doing it, pro forma. But in fact, we learn they are mourning. They're just not mourning for the same thing. They're hiding the real origin, the real cause of their mourning. And here, where they agree with the need to call for an avenger, when they get into it and start to talk about it, it turns out that they're talking about an avenger who's armed with Scythian sword. So they want vengeance, but it's not clear they want vengeance for what she wants vengeance for. So when you look at it in that way, you must ask, as we did in a different context in the Agamemnon, why on earth should they take Electra's side over Clytemnestra's side? Either they should be indifferent to whichever of their tormentors triumph, or they should in some way relish the killing of Agamemnon, because he, after all, is the one who was responsible for the destruction of Troy. So the title itself, Libation Bearers, makes it immediately clear that we don't know what's going on. We don't get what's going on here. So let's look at a sort of extended plot summary to see if we can sort it out. It looks fairly straightforward, the plot summary of the plot of the Libation Bearers, but it's loaded with little puzzles. I think I've mentioned this once before. On sweaters, there are little things that they call pills, little puff things and if they get really big, they don't look good, and so you want to get rid of them. And if you're not too smart, you'll start to pull on them. And if you're not careful and you keep pulling on them, the whole sweater unravels. Greek tragedies are like that. It looks obvious, it's perfectly smooth, looks like everything smooth as silk, but there's just this one little problem. Why do they call it libation bearers? And a few other little problems. And your job is to pull the pill so that you can unravel the thing that looks as though it's smooth as silk. And it's done intentionally by all of them. They put these little puzzles in for you that if you're curious enough and start to ask, that's when things really start to get interesting. So what's going on in this play? Orestes returns from Phocis, the city where he's been in exile, with his friend, Pylades, who is the prince of Phocis. He's surely one of the strangest characters in all of Greek tragedy. He has one line. In Sophocles' version, he has no lines. He's just there. In this one, he has one line. Orestes talks about him quite a bit, but then at a crucial moment, he says, "Oh, Pylades, what should I do?" Right after, for the first time in the whole play, Orestes calls his mother, mother. He says, "What should I do?" And I'm abbreviating it a little bit, but Pylades says, "Kill her," right? He doesn't say kill her, he says you have to do what the gods told you to do, and so on and so forth. But it's his only line in the whole play, and presumably Orestes might not have killed his mother if Pylades had answered differently. So he's crucial, but he's also a mystery. So Orestes leaves 2 locks of hair on Agamemnon's tomb. The tomb that you remember is located right in front of the palace. This tomb big enough for 2 people to hide behind, right in front of the palace. We know that's not, even if we didn't sense that there was something peculiar about that, the woman who killed her husband puts his tomb, 40 feet from her palace, just so that when she walks out in the morning, she won't forget that she killed her husband. There's an unexplained problem here. We know that because the plot of Sophocles' Electra absolutely turns on the fact that the tomb is about 20 minutes away. So things don't happen as they might have happened because somebody is on the way to the tomb and therefore misses somebody else who's coming to the house. So he leaves 2 locks of hair on the tomb. He sees these mourners, these libation bearers approaching, and the 2 men hide behind the tomb. The mourners are the libation bearers who are slaves, and Electra. It's not clear how interested they really are in avenging Agamemnon. Orestes notices that they're only going through the motions in comparison with Electra, who looks like she's genuinely grief-stricken. If you look at page 136, I think actually the way Lloyd Jones has translated it, you almost have to read it this way. Aeschylus is more subtle. Lines 82 to 84, you get, must I prove mastering the bitter repugnance that is in my mind, and I weep behind my sleeve. Wait, let's go back. Yeah, all right. I weep behind my sleeve for the hapless fortune of my masters, chilled by secret grief. It's less clear in the Greek, but masters here can surely be read to mean their masters and not Agamemnon. So Electra finds these 2 locks of hair, and she concludes that they have to come from Orestes. He must have sent them because it's just like her hair. Some of you who have siblings should wonder about this a bit, whether their hair has to be just like your hair, because even the same color, not alone the same texture, not to mention the fact that women would have taken care of their hair in a different way from the way in which men would have taken care of it. So a lock of his hairs shouldn't be exactly like a lock of her hair. But she concludes that Orestes must have sent them. She doesn't conclude that he's in Argos. But then she assumes this means he must not be coming himself. And so she despairs. Then she notices the footprints. She notices the footprints of 2 men. That turns out to be important. And then she puts her feet in one of them, and voila, they're identical to her feet, and therefore it must be Orestes. Who else would have feet identical to her feet? I have a note here to myself that I should go back and point out that in the first lines, when Orestes says, Hermes of the earth, you who watch over not your father's kingdom, but the father's power or kingdom. And later on, and on this mound of grave, I cry to Father to give ear. It is interesting that there's an ambiguity. You don't know whether he's talking about Orestes' own father, Agamemnon, or Zeus, the father of Hermes. So a certain doubleness there. I mentioned that because I'm jumping ahead of myself, but I can't help it. Yeah, I got the right ones on. The theme of this play, at some level, is going to have to do with the way a sign is always, always ambiguous. And so when it comes to things like motives and intentions, what was present in the Agamemnon is center stage. It's the issue that the whole of the libation bearers is concerned with. Okay, so where are we? Orestes, who has been watching all of this despair, finally pops out from behind the tomb with Pylades, and he says, "Hi, I'm Orestes." So why did he wait so long? What was the point of waiting until she goes into utter despair? And then, interestingly enough, Electra, who believes that her hair must be identical to Orestes' hair and her feet must be identical to Orestes' feet, doesn't recognize him. And it's only when he pulls out the weaving from the clothing he was wearing when he was sent to Phocis that he convinces her. Then Orestes tells them about the oracle of Apollo, which is apparently telling him to kill his mother. But if you look, first of all, as I mentioned, Orestes never actually says mother until he turns to Pylades and asks whether he should kill her. And interestingly enough, if you look at when he gives an account at lines 276 through 82 on page 146, when he gives an account of what the oracle says, it's only an indirect discourse. The oracle told me that. So you don't get the words of the oracle. You only get his report of what the meaning of the oracle was. And even that is very strange. It says, you'll break out in bliss. If you don't kill her, this will happen to you. You'll break out in blisters, and the rest of this parade of horribles that they announce that he'll be susceptible to. But of course, that's not a command to kill your mother. That's a claim that if you don't kill your mother, these bad things will happen to you. Okay, if then, not thou shalt. He's not following Apollo's orders. He's refusing to undergo terrible pain so that his mother might stay alive. So it seems like a small distinction on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's crucial because he's never actually told, kill your mother. So another of the little pills that we have to pull. Then, for reasons not altogether clear, we have one of the longest sections in which Electra and Orestes, together with the chorus, they trade back and forth in a chomos that substitutes for a stasimon. Reasons that we're never exactly clear about, they literally try to call Agamemnon up from his grave. They fail, of course, and the failure doesn't seem to change anything. It doesn't have, so we have this long attempt to get Agamemnon back from the dead, doesn't work, and then they go on and do what they were going to do anyway. The chorus at this point tell Orestes about Clytemnestra's dream with the serpent. She thought that the serpent was Agamemnon, what was biting her in the breast. Orestes reinterprets it in a rather obvious way to suggest that, no, I'm the serpent. Then he reveals his plan, such as it is, a plan which pretty much excludes them. He will go up, knock on the door, say he's a stranger at Xenos, and from Phocis, and ask to be admitted. So it looks as though we have a sort of provisional answer to why he hid in the beginning. He never really intended even to talk to Electra. But then the footprints revealed that he was there, and so it looks as though he was sort of forced to do something that he hadn't had a mind to do to begin with. Now at this point, the chorus sing an ode in which they give a series of examples of mythic murders of kin. So Meleager was killed by his mother for murdering his uncles, her brothers. Scylla kills her father, Nissus, out of love for Minos of Crete. The Lemnian men are all killed by their wives. Interestingly enough, not a single example of matricide in the whole list. Then Orestes inaugurates his plan. He adds a little bit by saying that he's really come to announce the death of Orestes. Unclear why he does that. He knocks on the door and he says, when he knocks, boy, calling on the servant, which leads to a response from backstage, and it doesn't seem like much to us, but it's absolutely unprecedented in Greek tragedy. Anywhere else, we don't have any example of a voice like that from off stage. Now, what's also interesting is that from here on, the tone of the whole play changes. So it's much more matter of, when you hear something like that, it's much more appropriate to Greek comedy than to Greek tragedy. This boy, it's something you get in Aristophanes' Clouds. It's something you do get, I think, in Aristophanes' Clouds. So in the middle of this tragedy that you're going to hardly understand because the language is so dense and lush and poetic that you throw up your hands in despair and begin to wonder why you ever decide to take this course on Greek tragedy, all of a sudden you get this sort of low-level appeal in which it looks like you're being introduced to a comic scene, and then you get the unprecedented response from within the house, from the servant. And after this, things change quite a bit. So much more matter of fact in its language, fewer of these highfalutin references. Orestes' former nurse is sent by Clytemnestra to summon Aeschylus and his guards. The chorus happen to intercept her by accident, not part of Orestes' plan, and tell her to cancel the part about the guards. If that hadn't happened, Orestes and Pylades would have been dead. So Orestes kills Aeschylus without revealing himself. That, if you look at line 274 on page 146, when Apollo apparently said to kill them in their own fashion, what he meant was without warning and without saying anything, and that in fact is what Orestes does with Aeschylus. He then confronts Clytemnestra as mother for the first time. So in this case, he doesn't actually obey Apollo. Apollo had told him to do it in the same fashion that they did it, which seems to mean do it silently, by surprise, without confronting them, and Orestes can't do that. He asks Pylades what to do. Pylades says, obey the gods, and then he kills her. So Clytemnestra sees it coming. Now, the chorus, I should get the good marker. In a meter that will be used in the Eumenides, they're Dochmiacs. It's a triumphant meter. It runs like this. I suppose you don't need to know this, but what the heck? It goes long, 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 short, long, short, long, long, short, long, 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 short, and then you have two shorts put together, which is equivalent to a long. So this is a meter which in the Eumenides is used to proclaim that justice will be done, is done, although they give it at that time an interesting etymology. They call it dike, which is a word for justice, is said to have come from dios kora, which would be maiden, or stretch it a little, daughter, damsel of Zeus. Dios is the genitive case of Zeus, which, since we know from line 160 of the Agamemnon that we don't know what to call Zeus, we don't really know who Zeus is, it doesn't really help much to know that justice is the daughter of the unknown. Now, finally, after Orestes gives an account of what he's done, he sees the Furies, nobody else does, says he's going crazy, and runs off. The chorus conclude by rehearsing the fates of Thyestes, Agamemnon, and they add Orestes to the list at the end. So lots of little problems that we need to think about, but also a couple of really big problems that need to be mentioned. No later than line 509, and maybe even a little earlier, Electra disappears from the play, and the chorus and Orestes' old nurse take over with regard to working out the plot. Now, you begin to see why Sophocles and Euripides plays about the same story. Electra stays beginning to end, and indeed both of these plays are called the Electra. If this play were called anything, it would, I suppose, have to be called the Orestes. But what's interesting is that here she disappears, and not a word is said about that. Whatever function she was to have played in the plot to kill her mother gets taken over by the chorus on the one hand, and a character we've yet to meet, Orestes' old nurse, on the other hand. Now, since she's so easily removed from the play, why is she there at all? Why do we need her at all? You put the whole thing a little differently. Why is it better for Orestes' success to depend on the help of slaves rather than Electra? You remember, it looks as though he didn't want any help at all from the beginning. Yeah.
I mean, if Electra had an heir, she could have done it much sooner.
Sure. I mean, this Electra never even thinks about that. The other Electras do. Right? So it's interesting. She thinks, by the way, does she expect Orestes to kill when he comes to kill the mother? Remember what they pray for at the beginning? They pray for Orestes to come home and for an avenger to appear. She must have been delighted when two people popped out from behind the tomb. She wants Orestes back, and she wants somebody to come to kill her mother. But there's no way in which she automatically thinks that those two things go together. Orestes is the interested party. The avenger would presumably be. You see that we've been beating this issue into the dust for the last few days. But if justice requires two things, real justice requires you have to be an interested party and you have to be detached. You have to have a detached avenger, and you have to have someone who cares that something be done. Well, out from behind the tomb, what do you get? You get Orestes, who has multiple reasons for wanting her out of the way, not the least of which, Electra introduces this. Look, you don't have she's taken all your property. So he's an interested party, and then you have the silent Pylades, whom Electra might have thought, oh, we were praying for two things, we got two things. So part of the reason she doesn't do it is because, in a way, she doesn't think that she should do it. She talks about her mother all the time. She uses the word mother all the time. He uses it only at the moment when he's about to kill her. That means he's suppressing the use of the word mother. It doesn't come naturally to talk around the issue in the way that he has to talk around the issue. So put the whole thing still differently. You need Electra for the recognition scene. But why do you need the recognition scene? It's infamously silly. Let me read you this from Euripides, a play we won't read, but could have. This is the Orestes' old pedagogos, his tutor is the translation here. I came here by way of the tomb, and in passing I knelt and I wept, for I found it deserted. Then I loosened the skin bottle that I brought your guests and poured a drink offering, and I placed myrtle branches about the tomb. But there on the pyre I saw a sheep with a black fleece that had been sacrificed and the blood lately poured, and so on and so forth. But perhaps your brother has somehow come here in secret, and he's paid his respects to your father's tomb. Look at this lock of hair and compare it with your own, and see whether the color of the shorn Clipping is the same. It often happens that people have the same blood of one father, have a natural resemblance in many parts of the body. This is a lecture. Your talk is not worthy of a clever man, old friend, if you think that my brave brother has come to this land surreptitiously out of fear of Aegisthus. Then how can a lock of his hair match with mine? The hair of a man reared in mobile sports with the hair of a woman combed soft? It's impossible. Besides, old man, you will find that many people have similar hair when they are not sprung of the same blood. Then step into his track and see whether the print of his boot is of a size with your foot, child. How could feet make any impression on a rocky surface? And if they could, the feet of a brother and sister, of man and woman, would not be equal, but the foot of the male is larger. If your brother did come to this land, is there no work of your shuttle by which you could recognize him, the clothes of which I stole him away from death? Don't you know that I was only a child when Orestes was exiled from the country? And if I had woven garments, how could he now have the same clothes he once had as a child, unless his clothes grew along with his body? This is Euripides having a lot of fun with the recognition scene. The Aeschylean recognition scene is in a way one of the most famous in Greek tragedy, and Euripides, as he frequently does, allows himself a very comical moment where he says, "Oh, come on, Aeschylus. Nobody's going to believe that." So let's look at Aeschylus's version and see if it's as silly as Euripides thinks it is. If you look on page 140, we can start with this. Line 167 following. Where am I? I see here upon the tomb a severed lock. Of what man or of what deep-girdled girl? That is easy for anyone to guess. How then may my old age learn from your youth? There's none but I that could have shorn it. Yes, for they to whom it fell to offer hair in mourning are his enemies. Yes, to the eye it seems very like. Like what sort of hair? That is what I wish to know. It's very like ourselves to look upon. Was this then a secret offering of Orestes? It seems very like his locks. And how has he dared to come here? He has sent a shorn lock in honor of his father. In your words lie yet greater cause for tears if his foot shall never more tread this soil. To my heart also rises a wave of bitterness, and I am pierced as though an arrow had transfixed me. And from my thirsty eyes there pour uncontrollable the drops of a stormy flood as I look upon this braid. For how can I hope that any other in the city is the master of this hair? Why, no, it was not his murderess who shore it, but my mother toward her children for me to assent outright. But my mother, in no way so called, having acquired a God-hated spirit, I'm retranslating some of this stuff, toward her children for me to assent outright and say this adornment comes from the dearest of mortals to me, Orestes. But hope is flattening me. If it had only sensible voice like Decaen, a messenger, so that I was not tossed this way and that in two minds. But either I knew for certain that I must reject this lock, supposing it were cut from an enemy's head, or it was kin to me and could share my grief. You see, the problem is that she has a sign and she doesn't have a clue how to interpret it. Or adorning this tomb and honoring my father. But the gods on whom we call know well by what tempests we, like Decaen, sailors, are buffeted, and if we are fated to find safety from a small seed, a mighty trunk may come. Yes, and here are tracks, a second proof of what I know, matching each other and resembling mine. Yes, here are two outlines of feet, his own and those of a fellow traveler. The heels and the marks of the tendons in their measurements agree with my own prints. Yeah, I'm not going to retranslate all of that. And then there are pangs, a word should be used of childbirth as well, and thinking, I am confounded. pray for the future as you make acknowledgement to the gods that your prayers have been fulfilled and that also you may fare beautifully. Why, what fortune, and so on, and then he reveals himself to be Orestes. So, it's remarkable because the argument, who could it be other than Orestes who did this, is stronger than the evidence that's supposed to support the argument. If we generalize it, what's the principle that underlies Electra's interpretation of these signs? You would have to say it's this, that to be is the same as to be like. Kinship amounts to identity. So Orestes is my brother, therefore we must have the same hair, the same feet, etc. Now, the difficulty is, of course, I mentioned before, if this were true, then it'd be very hard to understand why she doesn't recognize him immediately when he comes out behind the tomb. And he recognizes her only because of something she does, because her mourning is more authentic than their mourning. Now, that's connected to a bunch of other things. I hope this stuff comes together, we'll see. How do Orestes and Electra understand the crime of Clytemnestra? Look at page 183 at the top. Change the translation a little. What shall you, a father killer, share my home? He doesn't say my father killer, or it doesn't have to be read that way. A father killer. And then, back to 133, we get this. Wait. It's 133, line 15, yeah. Or shall I be right if I guess that they are bringing libations to Father, meant to appease those below? And then at 151, we get this. Toward the top. The dead is lamented, and the one who harmed is revealed, and the lament due to fathers and begetters. And then 2 pages later, 153, bottom of the page, nonetheless the debts due to parents shall be discharged. And 157, the last one, we get this, top of the page, you tell of my father's end, but I was far away. Now, all this by way of indicating that how do they understand Clytemnestra's crime? It's father killing. But that's not her crime. She killed her husband. She didn't kill her father. Now, look on 144. This is Electra. Oh, joy-giving presence that has 4 characters for me. For I must address you as my father, and you falls the love I should bear my mother, her I most justly hate, and that I bore the same seed, sister, who is ruthlessly smitten, and you were brother true to me, you who showed me due regard. Only may power and justice and Zeus the third, mightiest of all, be on your side. So she can't love Clytemnestra because he killed Agamemnon, because she killed Agamemnon. She can't love Agamemnon because he killed Iphigenia. So all that's left is Orestes. But the crucial thing is that he's literally identified with Agamemnon. Think about the beginning where Electra and the chorus pray at the tomb for two things, Orestes and an avenger. The two are not identified. Two people jump out from behind the tomb. Now, finally, when Orestes justifies himself for killing his mother in the end, first you get the chorus on 178 saying this, line 826. And do you with courage when there comes the time for you to act, when she cries to you, change the translation, this is rather important, child, utter father, and accomplish an act of horror none can blame. When she cries out to you, child, you utter father. Now, on the one hand, you can sympathize with Lloyd Jones's translation because it seems to mean, at first glance, Clytemnestra says, child. She's addressing Orestes on the one hand, but she's also referring to Iphigenia, and Orestes counters with father, namely Agamemnon. But Clytemnestra also says child and means Orestes, and Orestes corrects her and says, father. I'm not child. I'm father. I'm Agamemnon. And so at line 893, it's clear that when he just gives his justification for killing her, he says this, do you love the man? Then in the same tomb you shall lie, and in death you never lose him. He's talking about her relation to Aeschylus. What's interesting is that he accuses her now of the crime of adultery. I think it's a Greek law too, it certainly was a Roman law, that if the wife committed adultery and the husband caught the two of them in the act, in flagrante, then he was allowed to kill both of them. But if there was an intervening time, he couldn't. Right? So the passion of revenge was assumed to be legitimate in the moment if you caught them. So there is in a way, Orestes is saying your crime is adultery. But of course, that means that if the crime is adultery and he's punishing it in his own name, he is in a way acting as Agamemnon, not as the son. Now, how's all this connected? Orestes somehow recognizes that the only way for justice to be done perfectly, to fulfill Apollo's command, would be for Agamemnon to avenge himself. And therefore, at the beginning, this strange thing that they do, they try to call him back. They stand before his tomb and they utter prayers, and it goes on for a very long time. And you don't believe it at first because, they're grown-ups. They should know this isn't going to work. You don't know why it's there exactly, but now you see that there's something required, logically, it would in a way be perfect. The perfect solution would be for Agamemnon to come back and avenge his own murder. Of course, the problem with that is that if it were possible to bring people back like that to avenge their own murders, then the crime wouldn't be anything like as serious as it was, and it's not clear what the vengeance would be. It is also what underlies the very strange principle of the recognition scene. To be akin is identical to be. There's something crazy about that. But that's sort of what's necessary for justice to be possible. You have to get rid of decain, the adverbial decain. You've got to get rid of that. For real justice to be possible, it can't be Orestes coming back and pretending to be his father. It would really have to be the father. That's why Orestes has to work himself up as the image of his father in order to bring himself to kill her. I'm not the child, I'm the father. Child, no, father. And therefore, I charge you with adultery. I don't charge you with father killing, which is what I've been doing since the beginning of the play, but at this moment, I have to charge you with adultery. This working himself up into it is clear from the fact that he never uses the word mother until he turns to Pylades at 899 and says, should I kill her? When he says, Pylades, what am I to do? Shall I have shameful, can't read my own writing. I'll use his. Shall I respect my mother and not kill her? First time he's ever used the word mother. So that he fails to use her name or call her mother until now, until this point, can only mean that he's avoiding it. Something is restraining him from killing her, from killing the mother. Now, finally, that Orestes and Electra think of her at first as a father killer, that's somehow at odds with what we just went through, when she killed her husband, seems to mean that to justify their vengeance, they have to treat her as though her relation to Agamemnon were like their relation to Agamemnon. We know it isn't, by the way, because we start this play by hearing that she's had a bad dream. That's why the libation bearers are going to the tomb. She's had a bad dream? The Furies don't work that way. They don't let up. They don't give you one bad dream in 5 years or whatever it's been. They're unrelenting. We see that at the end. Orestes is chased out. So if the Furies are somehow responsible especially for punishing the crimes of slaying kin, what's clear that Orestes doesn't understand is that the relation between husband and wife is not the same as a relation between father and child. Husband and wife are, in a way, not a natural pair, but an artificial pair. They're put together in a way that can't be said of children and parents. Now, on the one hand, Orestes tries to make himself identical to Agamemnon, to justify himself as the punisher, as the avenger. On the other hand, he tries to make Clytemnestra identical to himself, to equate his suffering with her crime. He has to justify himself as an objective judge of the crime. He can do that only if his suffering isn't idiosyncratic. The play roughly divides in two parts. high drama, high language, up through 651. The Stasimon that ends at 651 ends with a reference to deep counseling fury, Erinus. And then 652, so this is the height of sort of tragic poetizing. 652, boy, and the spirit of comedy. At 554, Orestes tells them about his plan. I'm going to pose as a xenos, a stranger, that they have to allow in because of the rules of xenia. But he changes it by 652. Why? Well, it's one thing to give a summary of what you're planning, of what's going to happen. I'll kill the mother to avenge the father. That's the plan. It's quite another to actually do it. Orestes comes in with this bold plan. I'll pretend to be a stranger. I'll go in. I'll avenge the father by killing the mother. That's the overall plan. But then he has to knock on the door. And there's his servant who will either let him in or won't let him in. And he has to think up a reason so that the servant will let him in. And so now he says that, he's come to announce the death of Orestes. And once he gets in the house, it's not so easy to do everything. So there's a difference between the general plan, what you might call the planning, and what you might call plotting. It's what a dramatist has to do. When you have somebody exit, going this way, you can't have them enter coming this way without some sort of an explanation for why that's happened. So you have to have a coherent sense of how the movement actually takes place. So on this level, what's interesting is that Orestes has to confront not the mother, but his mother, Mom. And that's where he hesitates. You put the whole thing a little differently. It's not the particular that has to be overcome in order for justice to be possible. It's not the mother. It's real particulars. So the second part of the play points to this in various ways. On the one hand, the role that the slaves play. Think about the nurse. She gives what looks to be a wonderful and absolutely unnecessary and remarkably non-tragic speech about what it meant to raise Orestes, in which he talks about nursing him and changing his diaper and all sorts of things that don't look as though they belong in tragedy at all. It's like Don Quixote, wondering about how knights, whether they can carry extra underwear in their helmets, or we think about the problem of, okay, so they're dressed up in all this armor, looks like it requires almost a winch to get him on his horse. Well, how exactly do knights relieve themselves? It's how do you go to the bathroom if you're a knight? All of that belongs in comedy, but it doesn't show up in tragedy ever. It shows up in this tragedy because the nurse comes out and says, well, I diapered him and I took care of him and I fed him and I nursed him and so on and so forth. And then you realize that what she's really saying is, I'm his mother. In terms of particulars, there's a sense in which I'm his mother. Clytemnestra, in a way, in this regard, is sort of the mother, but I did everything that mothers really do. So Orestes' hesitation at the end comes not because he doubts the need to avenge the father by killing the mother, but because for the first time he realizes when he's face to face with Clytemnestra that he has to kill her, this real person. Now, this is connected to the very beginning of the play. If you go back to line 10, lines 10 through 16, actually, you get this. What do I see? What is this company of women coming in black robes? To what event can I refer it? Does some new disaster come upon the house? Or shall I be right if I guess that they are bringing libations to the Father, meant to appease those below the earth? It can be nothing else. Yes, I seem to see advance Electra, my sister, whose bitter grief marks her out, or whose Electra conspicuous for her bitter grief. So the difference between real grief and ritual mourning, even though real grief is frequently only expressible by way of ritual, is the difference between Electra and the chorus. Somehow, the libation bearers is an attempt to get at this phenomenon. The importance, the irreducibility of the particular. But to do it, it's got to do it in general terms. That's what mother means in this play. So it's somehow involved in pathemathos, learning through suffering. Aeschylus writes another play called Prometheus. Forgive me if I've mentioned this already, but it fits. The Prometheus is the play where Prometheus is being punished by Zeus for having given fire to human beings. And he's punished by, an eagle who comes down daily to eat his liver, and then at the end of the day, his liver is restored, and this happens over and over and over again. So sort of eternal suffering. And the question of the play is, in a way, how can a man whose name literally means forethought and who is said to be able to foresee everything and knew that if he did what he did, he would suffer in this way. He knew all of the details. How can this be a tragedy? He knew what he was getting into. He knew what it was. And he said, well, this is a deal I have to make. And he did it. So it doesn't look as though it can be a tragedy, but it turns out to be the paradigm of tragedy because the one thing he couldn't have known is what it really would feel like to have that happen every day. So the crucial thing that was absent was what you might call the naked particularity of it all, what it really means to have this eagle come down and eat at your liver. So in a way, what Aeschylus has done is he's written, in a way, the limit case of tragedy, where it turns out that you're not surprised by anything except something that you can't. I mean, if you asked Prometheus the question, what are you surprised about? What happened that you didn't expect? If he were to tell you, he'd just have to utter the same thing. Well, there's this eagle that comes down every day and it eats my liver out. And you said, well, you knew that. He says, yeah, I knew that, but I didn't know that the eagle was going to come down and eat my liver. But Prometheus, you knew that. But every time he tries to explain to you what he knew, the explanation comes out in generic terms and the particularity gets stifled. And so the thing that can't be brought up into speech is the thing that Aeschylus is trying to point to, and he wants to use the image of the mother as standing for that. Where the trilogy is headed is that in the humanities, Athena will attempt to tame this principle and give it a place within political life, and that's what the humanities ends up being about. If you try to think yourself on the other side of it and ask, what would have to be true? What would they have to think to be true for them to behave this way? Nothing could justify the killing of the father. So if you add that, then it looks as though, I mean, Iphigenia is after all mentioned. It's mentioned when Electra says, pretty straightforwardly, you're my everything, Orestes, because I don't have a mother. She killed my father. I don't have a father. He killed my sister. You're all there is left. You're my father, my mother, my sister, my everything. So she's aware of this fact, but apparently, under no circumstances is it allowable to kill the father. Now, it turns out what's so interesting about this is, when Apollo, when that moment when Orestes says, what Apollo told me? He told me I had to kill my mother, but then it turns out that he didn't say he said, if you don't kill your mother, all of this bad stuff will happen to you. Well, isn't it rather interesting that he does kill his mother and all this bad stuff happens to him because he killed his mother? So you can't kill your father, and apparently you can't kill your mother either, according to the Furies, who pursue him in this way and visit upon him all the terrible things that Apollo said would happen to him if he killed his father. Now, it's interesting that Apollo and the Furies are the prosecuting and defense, not the defense and prosecuting attorneys in the Eumenides. That has to do with the fact that you apparently have these obligations placed upon you that are in conflict with one another, and yet they're equally absolute. And what we see is that, well, on the one hand, that obligation is, Agamemnon is in a way standing for the political, and on the other hand, the obligation is toward the family, and they make equally absolute and undeniable claims upon you. Is he doing it because he feels himself a slave, or is he doing it because he feels himself a god? That's precisely the problem that she doesn't understand from the killing of. Is he doing it because he was told to do it by the gods and he doesn't have any choice and he's desperately upset about it, but he has to do it because they told him to? Or is he doing it because he's ambitious? Now, what's interesting is that the action in the end is identical. It's the motive that is ambiguous, and it's very unclear that when you look at what he did with the tapestry, you can be any more certain about the motive for that than you were certain about the motive. It's, by the way, just think about it for a minute. If you're Agamemnon, and you're in Aulis, and you have this seer screaming at you, you got to kill your daughter, the gods command it. And on the other hand, the other part of you is saying, I can't take all these ships to Aulis and not sail there. I mean, this is the story of my life. Who's going to write about me? How will I be immortalized? So finally, you make the decision. You say, I'm going to do it. Do you know why you did it? You have multiple motives. Do you know which one is really at work in you? So it's not just that other people can't know why we do what we do. It's not clear in the end that we're in a position to know why we've done what we've done. But you see, the problem with that is that you have just made Oedipus impossible, right?
In a sense, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because in a way, what you say might be true on the one hand, but the underlying question is, are human beings utterly consistent? Is it the case that we have things operating in us that are radically at odds with one another, and the fact that we behave in a certain way doesn't mean that the action that we take resolves that tension and sort of averages it out. it may, especially when it turns out that the action that you take is identical. So the question is, three possibilities. We're oversimplifying. You've got motive A and motive not A. They both lead to B. You do B. It looks as though that could mean you did it for motive A and you ignored motive not A. Or it could mean you did it for motive not A and you ignored motive A. Or it could mean that you somehow resolved the two into a third possibility which combined both of them, and that led to, but it's very unclear that we can know from the outside, looking at them, which of those things have happened. And as long as we can't know, then it looks as though, I mean, on the one hand, you could say Agamemnon could be a very reflective man who thinks it through and read this tragedy and figured out, I've got to resolve this tension and this is the way I'll resolve it. Or he could be, like most of us, acting on motives that are at odds with one another on the one hand, but it turns out for us, we don't see it because they lead to the same place anyway. Think about a noun, right? We can't get along without them. So I would say chair. I could even specify it more. I could say chair with a purple and black seat and a plastic black, I just go, but in fact, no matter how I particularize my description, the very act of giving a description always guarantees the possibility of more than one being falling under the description I'm giving. No description can be so absolutely particular that it precludes the possibility of multiple multiple instances of it. And of course, that's just a negative way of saying, why would you use language if it could only refer to one thing? The whole point of using language is that you can, nouns, is that they point to multiple things and it allows you to talk about chairs. So our experience is somehow tossed between, I mean, it's certainly the case that when you look at these things, you think at first chair, and in fact, your experience is, it's not clear that your experience is ever absolutely particular. You've always organized it before you have it. So it's not as though you can just pull it apart and say, oh, the real authentic experience would be the experience of the thing, the particular thing, because the thing always is a chair or a table or glasses or hair or whatever. So it does look as though something eludes us when we use language at all. But every time we try to articulate what eludes us, we do it in a linguistic way, and therefore it's unclear that we can capture it in language. And something like that is what Aeschylus is pointing to in the Prometheus play. And it looks as though it's what he wants to hint at the difference between what I called the perceptual relation between mother and child versus the conceptual relation between father and child. He wants to use the relation between mother and child as a metaphor for this issue about particularity. Well, I think that's why Electra drops out, because it's not clear what she thinks. She thought they were going to have two things, an Avenger and Orestes' home. So I think we're not allowed to see ultimately where she would have come out on this. And then there's Orestes, and I think that this has a lot to do with his belief that Apollo told him to do it. And indeed, that's what, when he says, when he asks Pylades the question, she's my mother, should I kill her? It looks as though he might not kill her. And it's at that point that Pylades says, you must do what the gods tell you to do. And the implication is Apollo gave you marching orders. So you see he's reproducing what Agamemnon did, one version of what Agamemnon did. And then just because we're meant to see that nothing's ever as simple as it looks, we remember that in the account of the evils that had been done to Orestes in that Comus, when they're talking about raising Agamemnon from the dead, we're told that one of the reasons Orestes is home is because he wants to reclaim his patrimony. So yes, the gods told me to do it, but also I'm homeless, I'm an orphan, and I don't have, what's he doing sitting in my house? And this is my country, it's not his country. So he's come back, and he has very selfish reasons, and he has selfless reasons. So he's not as grand as his father, so he doesn't want to be made immortal through the conquest of Troy and all of that. But he does want his city back, and he says, I'm just a tool. The gods told me to do it. That's exactly the Agamemnon position.